So it's great to see so many people. We have 90 people registered for today. I'm Catherine McMillan from Benalla Rural City Council, and it's with great pleasure that we are able to present this regional resilience in the COVID economy, thanks to some funding through Business Victoria, through our local events partnership program, and Startup Shakeup is also a major partner with us in this. So David Platt, I'll hand over to you. There'll be some questions. I think you'll introduce how we'll proceed, and then at the end, Elena will wrap up with our Startup Shakeup launch as well for the New Business Network. Thanks, David.
Terrific. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Just to quickly note that we are recording today's session. We'll produce a summary video of and the discussion that folks can watch back later on, or those who couldn't attend today could watch at some point down the track. We'll make that available through Startup Shakeup. Before we dive in, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all gathered today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. I'd also like to note that today is Are You OK Day, and we all know that one of the great challenges of working in the COVID economy as it's emerging is looking after our mental well-being as we adjust to this new version of normal. So can I just reinforce for everyone that an important question to ask colleagues and friends all the time, but particularly on a day like today, is just checking in, are you okay? I'd also like to, as Catherine has already done, really thank Startup Shakeup, Business Victoria, and Benalla Rural City Council for their great initiative to collaborate with us to get some thinking up around what is possible in the COVID economy and beyond. Just as a little housekeeping reminder, the general practice, as we know, for webinars these days is to be on mute. There's a hand-raising function in Zoom, so please raise your hand if you'd like to interject, or if you're struggling to find the hand-raising function, just unmute yourself, and I'll keep an eye on participants right the way through. And if I see somebody come off mute, I'll pause and throw over to questions. We also have some polling throughout today's session. So if you can, either through the device that you're joining Zoom on or through a mobile device, go to menti.com, menti.com, and you'll be able to answer the polls as we go through, and we'll do a bit of a practice poll in just a minute. And finally, excuse me, if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and make sure you're set to post to everyone. Elena and myself will monitor the chat, and there'll be structured breaks throughout today's session to pick up any questions that people are raising. But again, please, at any time, feel free to dive in with questions, comments, insights, observations you might have. The final thing I'll say just very quickly, a little bit about us, Resilient Futures. We're an organisation based in the Macedon Ranges. We're not quite as regional as yourselves, but we do happily consider ourselves part of the broader regional Victorian landscape. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm not originally from this part of the world. I spent the first nearly half of my life in the Boston area, but I've been in Australia for a long time now. The work that we do is very much couched in the context of a resilient future. So when we talk resilience, we're not talking about our ability to recover from shock, although that is important. We're talking about an ability to change before change impacts to generate sustainable value. So we're very much of the mindset that a resilient future is what we're all trying to work on together. So when we talk regional resilience, absolutely, recovery from shock is important, but what is equally and potentially more important, particularly in the world today, is our ability to anticipate where the next shocks might come from. And finally, the last thing, just very quickly about us, from time to time, what I'm speaking to today may sound a bit corporate. We get that feedback sometimes. Almost everything that we do has its origins deep in community economic development practice, both in the US and in Australia. What we do these days is work equally in organizational contexts and in community contexts. understanding again that resilience, particularly from a whole systems perspective, requires healthy businesses, healthy industry, healthy communities, and healthy individuals within those communities. So it's very much a whole systems based approach to the work that we do. In terms of today, what we've got 4 objectives. One is to start to explore the realities of what we're seeing as the new COVID economy, to see within that what is starting to drop away in terms of some conventional business models, operating models, and even in some cases, potentially parts of industries. What's starting to rise and replace business as usual, and what might that mean for all of you in terms of risk, opportunity, and innovation? And then what does it mean to start to find our way forward in this new COVID economy? Specifically, we'll be speaking to sort of 4 themes, if you like. The first is digging into the reality of disruption in the COVID economy, then looking at what does the COVID economy actually start to reveal? How do we leverage disruption, particularly through a framework that we have developed and used called strategy and action? And then what does all this look like in terms of moving towards regional resilience? I frame this as a catalytic conversation quite deliberately. Every time we're in conversation, whether it's a workshop, a meeting, a presentation, whatever it might be, we're trying to catalyze change. So it's not a conversation for the sake of conversation. It's what can we actually work on together? What can you work on together as a network to create change now, rather than waiting for change to happen and looking at how you might respond to it. And then finally, and I do this a bit up front, just in case people have technical issues and other things, but if there are 4 things that we really hope you start to think about as a result of today's conversation, this is about more than maintaining business as usual in a coronavirus pandemic. When we talk the new COVID economy, this is not about the virus. It's about what is being revealed socially, economically, environmentally, politically, educationally, technologically, etc., through a pandemic. So it's not about the virus, although the virus obviously is important. The COVID economy, as we see it, is an emerging new economy. And there's a lot of pushback around that. There's going to be a lot of tension around, going back to the way things were or going forward and creating something new. Our view is that creating something new is a much preferred pathway in the reality of disruptive change. Mindset, skill set, and strategic focus are what we find is most important for individuals, for organizations and communities, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail. And then the end game for us, as I've already spoken to a little bit, is this is about whole systems value generation. Again, healthy people, healthy industries, healthy businesses, healthy communities, as a whole system working together to generate sustainable value into the future. Again, I've mentioned it at the start, but just to reinforce, there'll be a bit of polling throughout. We're about to do our first poll, but also as a little bit of practice. And then please drop questions into the chat. Whenever we hit a slide that looks like this, we'll take a deliberate pause for questions, insights, and a bit of discussion as well. So if you haven't already, please go to menti.com. When you get there, enter the code 1481301 and have a crack at these first 2 questions. And all the questions will be framed similarly. Will it be strongly disagree or the equivalent on the left-hand side or the low end of the scale, and strongly agree or the equivalent on the right-hand side of the scale? So these first 2 questions are fairly generalized. Understanding the new COVID economy is important to me in my role or roles, and I understand, of course, many of you would be wearing multiple hats today. And then readiness to leverage disruption in that context is important to me in that context as well. Post today's session through Startup Shakeup and through the council, we'll also be providing summary feedback of all the polling results, and we'll also, any questions that sort of come through that we're not able to answer, we might take a few of those and provide some insights post today's session as well. All right, so we've had about 25 odd respond. I'll give it another minute or so, and then we'll push on. I'm happy to see that this is important for most of you. I would expect that you wouldn't be here if it wasn't important, but one never knows. Sometimes we get a little wild card in there. Okay, I'll move us on. Okay, so the reality of disruption in the COVID economy. Now, our expertise as an organization over time really has become about understanding the science behind disruptive change and how that works and how you can make that work for you. So what we talk about very much is grounded in some in the science of complex adaptive systems and also cognitive science, how the brain works, and our understanding of that and interpretation of that in a way that we find people can learn quickly and apply quite usefully. So a couple of aligning concepts. When we talk disruption, we're not talking about digital. We're not talking about necessarily Clayton Christensen's disruptive innovation, although we work through those frameworks and understand that. We're talking about any change in conditions that limits or prohibits an individual, organization, or community's ability to generate sustainable value. And we think in whole systems. So we're always looking for a disruption, for example, that's technological. What are the social economic implications? A health disruption. What are the environmental or political implications, and so on. So it's about thinking in whole systems. We also acknowledge that disruption is not new. It may be a buzzword, and maybe it's been a buzzword for a long time, but it's not new. For as long as human beings have been innovative, we've been disrupting ourselves. And we often say that one person's innovation is another's disruption. And sometimes it's important to be thoughtful about innovation in case we unintentionally disrupt parts of the system that we wouldn't like to do that to. I personally love this particular image because the wheel reminds us that over time, a simple technological disruption like the wheel and the evolution of the wheel has massive systemic implications. Our ability to transact, trade, move around the planet, tell time, set up manufacturing facilities, all come back to the wheel and the evolution of the wheel in various forms. What this also reminds us of is exponential rates of change. The time that it took to go from a stone wheel to a wooden wheel was thousands of years. Wooden wheel to wheel with spokes, hundreds of years to rubber, and so on. The time sequence shortens, and we start to get into that exponential experience of change. When we talk about leveraging disruption, we're thinking about leverage in terms of physics. It's actually using disruption as a force to create momentum, right? So it's understanding where those forces come from, how they originate, how they accelerate, and then how can we be on the wave of disruptive change, if you like, rather than being behind it or being dumped by it. Very quickly, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to reinforce a couple of key points. The experience of exponential change for most of us is from continuity to discontinuity. We go from life being okay to suddenly feeling out of our depth. The reality is, when you look at certain types of disruptive forces, like what happens in the environment, social economic change, the way that transactions flow through systems. I won't get deep into this transactional analysis, but that ICEP there is information, communication, education, production, and trading as different forms of transactions that flow through systems. And then, of course, technology has a real impact in terms of the speed of change. And what happens is that continuity to discontinuity is the way that we experience exponential change. What's most important is that there's most often a long tail to what can be a shock awakening for many people. So the point of that is that disruption often surprises us, but it shouldn't. What happens is most of us get comfortable over here and stop looking for what's over here. And when we hit the thresholds and the tipping points of those discontinuities, that's when we get surprised and shocked. And we're not very good at thinking exponentially. What happens these days, because these individual disruptors, if you like, start to converge in this exponential space, is that the scope, scale, systemic impact, the synergy between multiple disruptors and that speed of exponential change starts to put us in a very chaotic environment because we are really now experiencing disruption in whole systems. When you're in chaos, there's no real rules for how you proceed. As somebody said in a conference we were participating in last week around the future of work, there's no facts in the future, right? So as we get further into this exponential change, we have to rely more and more on insight, and intuition and common sense making in our networks to understand how we go forward. Because when you breach these thresholds, the information over here becomes a lot less relevant. And this is just a reminder that pre